Hey guys, welcome to a series of videos that I'm publishing here on YouTube that are all snippets of long form videos from my membership website, fromthefield.farm. And this site is all about producing long form, super detailed, educational style content. So it's a lot different than what you see here on YouTube. The videos are on average 1 hour long, and each week I publish a featured video followed by a Q&A video where I basically just take members' questions and produce it into a long form piece of content. That's actually turned into an audio podcast now because there wasn't really much reason to do it in video. If it's just me looking at the camera, if there's no slides or anything like that, or me showing anything, we might as well do it in audio. So we do that. I also produce all of the featured videos as audio versions as well, so people can listen to them when they're in the field, working, washing greens, or whatever. And that's what this site is all about. I interview all kinds of farmers in all kinds of sectors. You guys mostly know me as somebody involved in small scale and sustainable agriculture, but on this website my goal is to really broaden the picture and interview all kinds of farmers in all kinds of sectors, and they're not always organic either. I'm visiting a bunch of different growers this year all over North America, and my goal is to just help people understand agriculture better and take the best of these things and leave the rest. It's all about just educating people about what's out there so that we can help improve our system, because there's lots to learn from all kinds of farmers. You don't have to take everything at face value and literally. It's all about just taking the best of little bits and boiling that down into your context. So I hope you guys find this stuff helpful. Today's video is part of a 7-part series, and this is just a snippet of a 1 hour and 11-minute long presentation on restaurants. And this 7-part series, we explore all the different types of market streams that exist for small farmers and market gardeners, as well as talk about a lot of business principles and a lot of, we talk about social media and building a website and stuff like this, everything pertaining to marketing for small farmers. So this is just a small segment. I hope you guys enjoy it. Head over to fromthefield.farm if you do and sign up. I only open the membership of this website 4 times a year in 2-week intervals. So if you're seeing this video around the time that it was published, you still got time to get in there and join. It's open from April 5th to April 19th. We've got a whole community in there, over 2,000 people so far. We've got a forum where there's a discussion forum. People are talking about all kinds of stuff. It's all content-related conversations. There's no trolls. There's no haters. It's just people talking about the information. It's a great community, and I hope you'll join me. Head over to fromthefield.farm. All right, guys, enjoy. All right, guys, welcome to our second last video in this series. The last one in this series is going to be getting into web-based stuff, social media, marketing your stuff online and all that. But today we're going to talk about restaurants and chefs, and there's a lot to this. This is probably the longest one in this series, and there's so much to selling to restaurants, really, because the relationship you have with the chef is so important to how you develop your business relationship with them, that there's a lot of nuance to this. And we're going to cover a lot in this section. We're going to talk about what are the types of restaurants, how to approach restaurants, how to kind of build that customer base, how you can grow it. We're going to talk about the products. We're going to talk about fresh sheets and how you make these things, and how to get orders from chefs on a constant basis. And we're going to look at how you package the product for restaurants. There's a lot in this one, so hope you guys enjoy it. So we're going to cover a lot in this section on restaurants, and there's a lot of things to consider here. But let's just first start with identifying the types of restaurants that we're talking about. Like, we're not really talking about mainstream restaurants, though as these trends continue to grow and change, we might be. There is a possibility that at some point places like restaurants start to take on like a Whole Foods brand and are franchising and they're sourcing local. That's all possible. I don't know how logistically that would happen at this point in time, because these places like to have sort of a central place, especially franchises where they get their stuff. So I don't know logistically how that would happen, but you never know. Software and technology could change all of these things. But so for the moment, and for this presentation, we're talking about some specific types of restaurants, and I'm going to kind of go through those. But yeah, so we're not talking about big franchises, and even on the local end, we're not talking about really big sort of generic type restaurants. Like, all of these restaurants are going to be focused on local, and they're going to be putting that in their branding. And we're going to talk about more, like, how to look for restaurants, how to approach them, and we'll kind of go through a short list on where you start there. But for now, let's just kind of identify what we're talking about. So I like to imagine sort of a scale of where you have like smaller restaurants that are generally lower maintenance, easier to work with, but the orders will be lower, generally speaking, smaller, I should say. And then you've got higher maintenance restaurants, larger scale on the other end. And if you can find this sort of perfect intersection, which I'll explain once we go through this part, you want to hold on to those kinds of customers forever. So the best place to start are small restaurants, owner-operator type ones. The guy in the image here is the owner and chef of this restaurant. They've got 12 to 15 tables with a couple chairs at each one. Like, they're not big, but they might seat 100 people in an evening. And generally speaking, these types of restaurants are going to be a little easier to deal with, especially at the beginning when you're first trying to figure out how your production system works. You're trying to, be consistent with the same things week in and week out. The pressure is going to be a lot less with restaurants like this, and so these ones are generally easier to deal with. So these will be on the sort of the left side, my left side of the scale, where they're smaller, they're lower maintenance, they're easier to deal with. They'll change their menu constantly. So things like if you were promising to bring them 12 cases of beets every week, but you had 10 one week, then 12 the last week, it's not a big deal. Whereas you'll see when we get into the higher maintenance, the higher scale, upscale type restaurants that move a lot of volume, they want exactly the thing that they asked for every week because they don't have flexibility in their menu. When you got a restaurant that has lots of people working at it, there is a huge hierarchy of command. There's way less flexibility on what they can or cannot use week after week. Whereas on the smaller restaurants, they're going to be way more flexible with that. Restaurants like this one here, this guy changed his menu every week depending on what he could get from his farmers. And that gives a lot of optionality to you as the grower, and so thus it makes it a great place to start because there's a lot less pressure on you. So we're talking about, these could be cafes, juice bars, small table type restaurants. A lot with these, the owner is the primary operator. The owner is the chef. The owner's writing the checks. These restaurants are, generally speaking, easier to work with. They'll pay you on time. There's not going to be a lot of complications with who pays you because it's usually just one hierarchy of command. But as we go through this list, you'll see how it can get more complicated. So then you got medium-sized restaurants. And again, all of these are local focused. It's in their branding. It's in the whole identity of what their restaurant does. So these medium-sized restaurants, these could be a breakfast, lunch, or diner. Maybe they do 3 meals a day. I find, generally speaking, restaurants will either do 2 or 3. There's not, especially in the local centric type markets, there's not really a lot of restaurants that are open all day. But there's many exceptions. But in pretty much, the only exceptions for me would have been on the larger end, and we'll talk about those. But on the medium-sized restaurants, these are restaurants that are downtown. Generally, they're either going to be a breakfast joint, or they're going to be maybe a lunch, brunch, or breakfast, brunch, and lunch type thing, or they're going to be a dinner type restaurant. They're usually going to be specialized to something in there. And even with these ones too, at the medium-sized restaurants, the chef might still be the owner-operator, but then there'll be a little bit more of a line of command. You might not talk to that chef all the time, but you will talk to them every now and then. Now, when you get into the larger size restaurants, what we're talking about here are hotels, resorts, and wineries and places like this. So they are going to have a quite a hierarchy. There's going to be, at the very top, there's the owners, the proprietors. Beneath that, you're going to have the executive chef. Beneath that, you're going to have an executive sous chef, an executive chef de cuisine, French terminology that they use in restaurants. And then you're going to have line cooks. You're going to have just other all-purpose kitchen staff. Then you're going to have servers. There's already quite a hierarchy in that. And so that's important to understand, because when you talk to restaurants like this, who do you talk to? And that's important to establish on who you do talk to, because that's going to be your line of communication. And I'll say, just sort of ad lib here, the more you get into selling to restaurants, the more you want to know higher and higher up the food chain who to talk to, because with restaurants, there's always turnover. And even an executive chef will leave, and an executive chef leaves, and that was your only line of communication. Who do you talk to next? So what's really important to understand when you're selling to restaurants is that you know a lot of people in that kitchen. You want to know the executive chef, you want to know the sous chefs, you want to know the line cooks. It's always a good idea to know the names of at least 5 people when you go into that restaurant by memory, so that you have a line of communication, so that if there's a change of staff, you know who else to talk to, so that you don't have to rebuild that relationship and completely start from scratch. And believe me, I've done that, and it's a real hassle to do that. And that this is one of the built-in disadvantages and risks that you run when you sell to restaurants, is that they are high turnover, people change. And I mean, I've sold to one restaurant that was, I would say, more on the high end one we're going to talk about in a second here. It was a winery, high-end winery, and their entire kitchen staff turned over from one year to the next. So the executive chef left, the line cooks, all the sous chefs, 100% turnover. Maybe a couple of the servers were the same, but I didn't know the servers. I only know the kitchen staff. And that was a whole hassle. So in that 1 year, I actually stopped selling to that restaurant. Then they had a new executive chef that came back that I knew from another restaurant that I'd previously worked with, that came in, and that relationship kind of just rebuilt itself. But these are the risks that you run with this, and we'll talk more about pros and cons in a minute. We'll kind of get into that, but I want to just kind of outline to you what are these types of restaurants, and what are the kinds of places you're looking for. So on the high end stuff, this is where you're going to have the high maintenance, meaning that you're going to have to do a lot of customer communication to stay in touch with that restaurant. High-end restaurants, particularly these luxury ones, the 5-star, the Michelin star type places, they've got farmers calling them all the time. So the competition is high. You're going to be competing on price. Primarily, you're going to be competing on quality. The high-end places really just want quality. They don't mind paying a bit extra, but the quality's got to be 100% all the time. The orders have to be consistent. Your supply of each type of product you're going to be offering has to be consistent every week. If you can't play in that ball game, then you don't even want to get there. This is why I say it's best to start with the small type places, because they're going to be lower maintenance, easier to deal with, flexibility with your production. On the high end, you're going to be dealing with big ego type executive chefs, even big ego staff, who they all want that position too. They're all vying for that position, and there's a real pecking order when you get to these types of restaurants. And so, I would say if you're in a town that has a lot of the first 2 or even 3, stick with that. You don't need to get into the Michelin star restaurants, but if you do, they can really elevate your profile. And there's a number of farmers that I know in the United States that have started selling to these high-end places, and they're on the social media with these high-end restaurants, and it can immediately elevate your profile, and it can lead you to all kinds of other possibilities. But you got to be prepared to do that. You got to be the type of person that wants to be in that limelight and deal with those kinds of people. Because let me tell you, when you get into that high-end scene, the egos are unbelievable. And I've been in some situations where I've dealt with some real BS from people. And I don't put up with BS. If some high-end chef thinks he's, the cat's meow and he wants to take it out on me, I don't deal with it. I don't care. Life is too short. And I've told, at least on 2 instances, I've told some chefs where they could stick it. So I don't put up with it. So and later in my career, I stopped dealing with that. I started cutting these types of restaurants out, and I just ended up selling to the restaurants that were really easy to deal with. They paid on time, and they were nice to deal with. They were low maintenance. They ordered consistently. That's who I stuck with. So, this is just kind of what's out there and some things to consider. But it's really up to you and where you want to be. Definitely on the larger end, the advantage there is going to be larger orders. And on the smaller end, it's going to be smaller orders, but lower maintenance. So, it's really weighing the pros and the benefits. So let's look at some of these pros and cons in detail. So the benefits of selling to restaurants is, in general, they're going to buy larger volume. So, if you're coming from a place where you're just doing farmers markets, maybe you run a small CSA, and we've talked about these subjects specifically. If you haven't, I would encourage you to go back and look at the previous week's videos. And so the larger volume does help. Like when I was in my 3rd year of farming is when I really started turning up the dial with restaurants. I had customers that were purchasing, their orders were like $500 at a time. And for a relatively new grower, that was big news for me to basically put together a $500 order. It didn't take much more time than to put together a $100 order. And I'm just speaking about the assembly. I'm not speaking about harvesting the product. But so, it really allows you to be more effective with your time on the farm if you're assembling bigger orders than it is small orders. That's somewhat self-evident, I think. But for me, it was huge, and it really allowed me to take my farm to the next level. Another benefit that I had earlier on, and these are benefits that any farmer is going to find if you start selling to restaurants like this, is they're going to promote your farm, your name, and that can get your name, your brand out there. If you have good brand recognition, that's going to be significant too. Like last week we talked about retail. I talked about branding a little bit. Good branding is definitely going to help you with selling to restaurants, because what some of these fancy restaurants will do is that they will actually put your brand on the bottom. So on the bottom of their menu, they'll have like a little line, and they'll say, our restaurant is supplied by these great producers, and they'll put your brand right in there. And for them, it's kind of bragging rights too. And on the flip side of that can get annoying as well. Like, I know I'm talking about benefits here. I'm derailing for a second, but I just want to tell you a quick little story about, well, there was actually about 3 or 4 restaurants that did this to me, but there was one that I really had to bring the hammer down on, where they were bragging, in their social media, on their menu, at the restaurant. They'd have a little sign on an A-frame standing there, product featured by so-and-so and so-and-so. They were promoting my brand, my farm brand, and they hadn't bought product from me in over 6 months, like probably even that year. Like, it was ridiculous. This is a long time ago, actually. This is probably like 5 or 6 years ago, but I was on a date, not with my wife. This is when I was still single. I was on a date, and I took a date to this restaurant because it was good food. It was Indian food. I love Indian food. And I see my name all over the menu, and we actually ordered a salad, and it wasn't my greens. And I was mad. I went into the kitchen, and I talked to the woman who I knew. We knew each other from foodie events and stuff like that. And I said, "What is this? I ordered a salad. You've got my farm name on the menu. This isn't my greens. You guys haven't bought greens from me in a long time." She was so embarrassed. And of course fixed the problem. But I mean, a lot of restaurants, especially in this era where there's a lot of feel-goody stuff around the food scene. It's like saving the world. It's promoting local. There's a lot of sexiness and romanticism with it. There's also a lot of BS. And I find that quite annoying if people are promoting your stuff. At the same time, what are the pros and cons of a restaurant saying you're on their menu and they're not? I mean, the pros are they're promoting your brand. However, if they're selling crappy greens and that comes back to you, that doesn't look good either for you. So What do you do about it? I don't know. I mean, I certainly had to confront this group, and I did have other restaurants in the past that had stopped buying from me, but then they kept me on the menu, and I'm kind of like, you guys, like, that's not honest. You're just not being honest. And so, anyways, needless to say, to go back to what we're talking about here specifically, is restaurants can promote your name and they can elevate your profile, especially if you're leveraging social media. And that's what we're gonna talk about. We're gonna get into all that stuff next week. We're gonna talk about social media and all that stuff and how this kind of integrates to the whole thing on how you promote yourself. But if you're leveraging social media, there's certainly advantages to that by having them tag you, and you're promoting them, and it's reciprocal. So there's definitely benefits to that. And the relationships from chefs will lead to other opportunities. I can tell you, we talked a little bit about earlier on here about the high turnover in restaurants. Like, this is just part of the risks that are part of it. But the advantage of that is that these sort of young people that come in, they might start as line cooks. They might even start as dishwasher, get promoted to a line cook. Years down the road, they're an executive chef at a new restaurant that's opening up. So by you building those relationships in the kitchen, this is why I said, when you go into that kitchen, you want to know at least 5 people's names. Obviously, the top people, you want to know their names: executive chef, sous chef, chef de cuisine, stuff like that. But you want to know who's the kind of the top line cook, who's one of the primary servers or something like that. You want to know those people because they're going to go to other places and start other restaurants or be involved in other projects, and they're going to call on you. So those relationships are really important. Now, things to consider, perhaps the cons, right? Pros and cons here. Restaurants are risky business, right? We kind of already established that. There are just inherent risks of selling to restaurants. They are notorious for not paying their bills. I have been burned at least a half dozen times in my career doing this, and there was one year in particular where I was burned really badly. I had one restaurant that was actually a group of restaurants owned by the same person, same executive chef, same sort of investors. They started 4 or 5 restaurants that year. All of them burned me because they all went bankrupt because one of the guys had a big drug addiction, was partying and living the high life, spending all the money, and just an absolute train wreck. They cost me $8,000 in unpaid bills that I never got. And what happened there was actually, just to kind of give you an idea how these things might go, is when you start selling to a restaurant, you're going to set up terms. And we talked about this a bit in retail. It's like, what are the terms? Might be net 30, net 14, whatever. You drop off an invoice, then that invoice gets paid in this certain number of days. What happened here was these guys were paying their bills. I was getting the checks and depositing them in my bank. I'm putting this into my accounting software. Paid. I get a letter that's like NSF, notice non-sufficient funds. So all these checks I had cashed bounced. And so that was literally $8,000 of checks, and I kept selling to them in the meantime. And so the whole thing was a nightmare. There's a lot more to the story, but it was brutal, and I got burned. And to be honest, to go and get your money sometimes is not even worth the money that you're going to get back. And so you can go to collections, you can get the government involved. You can get like a bankruptcy claim and all this stuff. You can get in line to get your money when they go bankrupt. But, sometimes it's just not even worth the effort. And for me at that time, I was on a growth trajectory. My farm was growing. I was also doing a lot of stuff off farm, a lot of public speaking. I had a lot on my plate. For me, I had to really assess. I'm putting a lot of energy, a lot of negative energy into this, and it's really slowing me down. For me, it was easy just to kind of wipe my hands clean from it, write it off, forget it, move on so I can stay positive and keep moving forward. And so that was my big lesson there. But yeah, they're notorious for not paying their bills, and you got to be careful here. And, when you start selling to restaurants, they can really only burn you once. And so my the way I've done it in the last couple of years is I will not sell to any restaurants that are brand new. If you just opened up, I'll sell to you, but it's COD. You pay cash on delivery. If you can do that for an entire year and your restaurant stays solvent, great. Going forward to the next season, now we can look at terms. But I'd been around the block enough times. I know enough about how the industry works. You know, one thing I didn't say to you guys is I actually grew up in the restaurant industry. My dad started a restaurant that he later franchised. It was like a fish and chips joint, so it wasn't high end. It wasn't serving local or anything. But I did learn a lot about the industry when I was growing up because it was my first job, washing dishes and then doing other general things in the kitchen. And I learned a lot about how restaurants work, and they're notorious for not paying their bills. It's very risky business. 80% of them go out of business in the first couple years, and even a smaller percentage of them last 5 years. So it's risky, needless to say, and I could talk about that all day. But you really just gotta make sure you cover your bases. Make sure you're setting up the right terms with them, and if they miss an invoice, don't deliver again until that invoice is settled. And you're of course going to find exceptions to these rules. You might have a relationship with a restaurant for a number of years and they're late on a couple invoices, but they've never really burned you in the past. You find reasons and exceptions to the rule where you're going to flex with your customers to make them happy and to continue to do business with them. But that's your judgment call. It's up to you. I find you really got to read people. You got to really learn about, these are things outside of just the restaurants. This is just, personality things. But you find the right types of people that you want to work with, and the others, you just won't go near. And there's certainly some people where I'm in situations in business where I talk to somebody, and in the first 10 minutes I realize this is not the kind of person I want to do business with or be around with constantly, so it's not worth it. Life is too short. Now, however, at the beginning, you want to get your name out there. Your standards are going to be a little bit lower. You're going to kind of cast a wide net, right? We've talked about this in marketing in general. You cast a wide net. You get some things out there. You get the feelers out there. You see what works, what doesn't. Eliminate the things that aren't working. Double down on the things that are. It's the same thing with people. It's the same thing with relationships. And that's kind of how you work your way up the hierarchy, and eventually, hopefully, in a few years, you have a handful of customers that are really bringing you 80% of your business for the restaurant side of your business. And you got a bunch of other customers that are sort of smaller. And then maybe you just eventually cut out all those smaller customers and you just focus on the ones that are bringing you the most value. You try to find ways to offer more value to them, to leverage them more as good customers. And then you can really grow your business there. Also make your life a little easier too, because you're not dealing with BS. And okay, so the whole restaurant industry is high stress. When you're serving, my dad always said this when he was in the restaurant business. He said, "You're only as good as your last meal." So the last customer that walked out the door, if they weren't happy, they're going to tell 10 or more people that they weren't happy. Whereas if they are happy, they might tell 5 or less. Bad news travels quickly. In all types of business, in life in general. We hear a lot of gossip and a lot of negative stuff on the news, barely any good news, right? Negative news travels fast. Don't know why that is. It just seems to be the way it is. And so that helps contribute to a high stress environment for the restaurants, because the owners are really wanting to make sure everybody's happy, and that passed down to the executive chef, the people in the kitchen, and then that comes from the servers. And if the servers are bringing back bad news, that creates a bad stressful environment there. So that's just generally the nature of the beast. Now there are some exceptions. I've had maybe 1 to 3. Let's call it 3. I've sold to well over 20 different restaurants in my career doing this, and there was probably 3. One in particular I can think of where they really had the best, most positive atmosphere I'd ever seen. There's no turnover with the staff. They pretty much had the same staff for the entire time I sold to them. The executive chef was a really nice guy, went out of his way to make sure everybody was happy. That is rare. And if you can find that type of customer, hold on to them. And, even if they're not necessarily the biggest numbers customer, just the fact that they make it easier on dealing with them is easy. The orders are easy. They're low maintenance. They always pay on time. Oh, if you can get that kind of thing, hold on to that.